A federal judge thought his black robe made him untouchable, but when he crossed Pam Bondi, she brought his whole world crashing down. You won't believe what just happened. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. She didn't walk into that Tallahassee press conference like a politician. She walked in like a reckoning. Her hair was pulled back, her voice calm but cold, and in her hands a stack of sealed documents that no one had seen before. No script, no teleprompter, no rehearsed notes. Just her and the truth, ready to explode. Every camera zoomed in, every journalist froze. You could feel it. Then she said the sentence that shook the country. This isn't political. This is about trust, and Judge Boasberg has broken it. And just like that, the room fell silent. Her words didn't just echo. They reverberated across every courtroom, newsroom, and living room in America. People stared at their screens, trying to make sense of it. A sitting federal judge facing criminal charges? This wasn't some political thriller. This was real life. At first, no one knew what to believe. It felt impossible. Boasberg had spent years in the background, always present, always quiet, a man with connections from K Street to Capitol Hill, but never one to make headlines. Until now. And Pam Bondi? She didn't flinch. Her voice pierced through the confusion like a scalpel. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. The message was clear and dangerous. Just 48 hours earlier, whispers had started swirling inside the Department of Justice. Soft voices, quiet doubts, mentions of a sealed file, an internal audit, a case review that wasn't supposed to exist. At the center of it all, Boasberg, the same judge who had just issued a late Friday restraining order blocking the deportation of 5 men with suspected ties to Trindagua, a gang so dangerous even seasoned ICE agents refused to speak their name aloud. To Bondi, this wasn't a misstep. It wasn't bad judgment. She called it something else entirely: judicial sabotage. What made it worse was how the order came down, not in writing, not even on the record. Just a vague verbal ruling delivered behind closed doors with no paper trail. Homeland Security thought the lack of a signed order meant they could proceed. So they did. Within hours, deportation flights resumed, and almost immediately, the chaos began. Reporters flooded ICE field offices, protesters lined up outside federal buildings, but behind the scenes, something had snapped. Bondi had already been in touch with DHS and the White House counsel. On a late-night call, she didn't hold back. "He's protecting criminals," she allegedly said. "He's not interpreting the law. He's hiding behind it." That single call wasn't just a warning, it was the first domino. And it wasn't political theater, it was something far more calculated. Because what no one knew yet, not the press, not the public, was that Bondi and her team had already been quietly building a case. Secret interviews, whistleblower memos, encrypted logs, months of digging through Judge Boasberg's record, not just his rulings, but his behavior, his communications, his patterns. And what they found? It wasn't just suspicious, it was explosive. She had flagged everything. A suspicious pattern of rulings, especially in national security cases, instances where Boasberg's decisions deviated wildly from legal norms and always seemed to benefit a certain kind of defendant. She didn't say everything at the press conference, not yet, but she made one thing very clear: obstruction of justice was on the table. Misconduct in office, abuse of power. It was all fair game now. As her words were dissected across every major network, the country split into 2 camps. Critics claimed she was going too far, accusing her of launching a personal vendetta. But supporters, they called her fearless. Finally, someone was standing up to the judiciary, holding power accountable no matter how high it sat. Bondi didn't slow down. She wasn't interested in sound bites. She had pulled the pin, and now the whole system was bracing for the blast. But what made her go this far? Why Boasberg? Why now? Long before the headlines, James E. Boasberg had been seen as untouchable. A polished Georgetown graduate, a Yale Law alum, his resume glittered, and so did his Rolodex. He wasn't feared because he was powerful. He was feared because he played the game just right. To challenge him was to challenge the entire machine. Years ago, he started his rise in D.C., first as an associate judge, then as a district judge appointed by Obama. Eventually, he was elevated to chief judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, a post that gave him access to some of the most secretive matters in the country. That position alone gave him enormous behind-the-scenes influence. He was the one who signed off on surveillance orders, wiretaps, and national security protocols, the kind of judge you didn't question. Until now. But Bondi had been questioning him, quietly, relentlessly, and it wasn't because of a single ruling. It was a pattern. Years ago, when the FBI got caught mishandling surveillance warrants in Honolulu, it was Boasberg who reviewed the aftermath. His rulings were cautious. Some said responsible, others said weak. Slaps on the wrist, warnings, no actual accountability. Behind closed doors, critics began whispering, Boasberg wasn't defending the law, he was defending the institutions. And Pam Bondi? She never forgot those whispers, especially as his name kept popping up in high-stakes immigration cases, often with curiously timed delays, procedural loopholes, and outcomes that left Homeland Security scrambling. She started to connect the dots. And then came the deportation restraining order, the moment that changed everything. It wasn't just vague, it was precise in all the wrong ways, designed to stop enforcement without leaving fingerprints. Inside DHS, panic erupted. "We got no paperwork," said one internal email. "Are we really grounding flights based on a hallway comment from a judge?" Flights proceeded. Boasberg threatened contempt, but legal experts noticed something chilling. There was no enforceable ruling behind the threat. Bondi's team was livid. This wasn't a mistake, it was manipulation. That night, she authorized a full investigation, a deep dive into Boasberg's entire judicial history, not just the rulings, but the notes, the clerk communications, the redacted filings, the off-member scheduling tricks. And that's when they stumbled onto something strange. Unusual correspondences, specifically in cases involving encrypted technologies, namely Signal. At first glance, it looked like a technical footnote, but Signal had quietly become a flashpoint, a messaging app with auto-demik features, used by senior officials to conduct sensitive conversations without any record. Bondi's team flagged the trend, and then it all clicked. In early 2024, a small watchdog group had filed a lawsuit. It alleged that Trump-era officials had used Signal to sidestep transparency rules, coordinating covert operations without leaving any trace. That case landed on Boasberg's desk, and instead of recusing himself, despite his personal ties to several names in the filings, he stayed on the case. He sealed witness lists, closed hearings, blocked press access, and pushed the timeline deeper into the shadow. Bondi wasn't just frustrated, she was convinced. She believed Boasberg was protecting people, shielding key evidence, delaying proceedings just long enough for trails to go cold. And that's when things got personal. The room was narrow, the carpet dull, the lights too soft to be comforting. It smelled faintly like old printer toner and burnt coffee, the kind of stale scent that clings to government buildings where secrets live. At the Department of Justice, tucked behind a soundproof door on Constitution Avenue, Pam Bondi sat with her most trusted advisors. Her arms were folded, her jaw set like concrete. The tension in the room wasn't loud, it was heavy. "We can't ignore this," she said, her eyes fixed on Deputy Counsel Arlen Stokes. "Not anymore." On the table in front of them sat a folder, not thick, but thick wasn't necessary. All it took was a few pages, 3 or 4 pieces of paper with the power to detonate everything. Inside the folder were excerpts from encrypted Signal chats, recovered not from the public, not from a leak, but from a quiet subpoena issued to someone on the fringes of the case, someone who'd seen enough to know something wasn't right. They didn't call a reporter, they sent it straight to Bondi's office. One message stopped her cold. It was sent from a federal staffer directly to Boasberg, 2 months before the Signalgate case even hit his docket. The words were casual, like nothing out of the ordinary, but the tone was chilling. "They're planning to dump some of it in late March," the message read. "But don't worry, Jay, I've got it covered on our end." He read it twice, then a third time, and that's when she noticed her hands were shaking. Stokes tried to defuse it. Could be nothing, could be misread, but Bondi wasn't buying it. "It's not just this message," she said. "It's the redactions, the verbal rulings, the sealed doors, the missing records. It's too clean." Then she said the line that changed the course of everything. I'm not letting this get buried in some Inspector General's report 3 years from now. That was it. In the next 72 hours, her office became a war room. Legal prep, press strategy, internal briefings with White House counsel. This wasn't a leak-and-see approach. This was precision. Bondi wasn't aiming for scandal. She was aiming for results. But what the public didn't see, what no one reported, was what happened just before she went public. 2 days before the press conference, Bondi got a phone call, a quiet one from a retired federal judge in Phoenix, someone who'd been on the bench for decades, who'd watched Boasberg's career unfold from a distance, and didn't need headlines to see the truth. "You sure about this, Pam?" "I am. You'll burn a lot of bridges." "I'm not here to make friends," she said. "I'm here to clean house." She didn't say it with rage. She said it with resolve. She knew what this would cost, her political capital, her standing, maybe her career, but she also knew the cost of silence. That morning, as she stood at the podium and said Boasberg's name out loud, confirming the investigation, the sealed files, the internal subpoenas, she crossed a line there was no coming back from. And she knew it. But so did everyone else. The story exploded across every screen. Signalgate was no longer just a niche case. It became a wildfire. Cable news couldn't get enough. Podcasts dissected every word. Reddit threads lit up like flashbangs. The hashtags trended by the hour. And underneath all the chatter was a single, growing suspicion. Who was Judge James Boasberg protecting, and why? Because Signal wasn't just an app. It was a weapon in the wrong hands, designed for privacy, used for secrecy. And in the world of politics and power, those two things weren't the same. During the Trump administration, Signal use had skyrocketed behind closed doors. Staffers, officials, even senior advisors began using it to plan meetings, discuss policy, and avoid paper trails. Why write emails that could be subpoenaed when you could use messages that vanished in minutes? That was the root of the lawsuit filed in early 2024, small at first, almost laughable. A watchdog group from San Diego claimed government officials had bypassed public record laws using a phone app, but it didn't stay small for long. Internal documents started to surface. Redacted calendar entries, disappearing schedules, deleted digital logs, the kind of gaps that shouldn't exist. People started asking questions, and then the names came out. These weren't junior staffers, they were major players. A former national security advisor, an undersecretary of defense, even a legal consultant who'd worked directly under Boasberg during his FISA court tenure. Yet despite the mounting concerns, Boasberg didn't recuse himself. He didn't even acknowledge the connections in court. He simply moved hearings into closed session, sealed the records, and issued brief procedural statements. It was like watching a magician make evidence disappear. Only no one was clapping. Bondi's team had had enough. They pushed hard, using a narrow national security window to compel Signal's servers to release message metadata. It wasn't easy, but it worked. And what came back? It wasn't complete, but it was enough. One message stood out above all. It was from a legal assistant tied to the lawsuit. It read, "Day B says we'll bury it in pre-trial. No panic, no files go public unless forced." 3 days later, Boasberg delayed discovery. To a casual observer, it might have looked procedural. Judges delay discovery all the time, but in light of that message, it looked like a chess move. A quiet, careful cover-up. To Bondi, this wasn't caution, it was control. She saw Boasberg not as a fair-minded jurist, but as a gatekeeper, one who protected people on both sides of the aisle, one who understood exactly which messages, which names, and which secrets couldn't see daylight. That night she called a meeting with her legal strategy team. "If we don't act now, the window closes," she told them. "This case gets sealed, the public never hears a thing." One advisor hesitated. "You think he coordinated a cover-up?" "I think," she said, "he knew who'd be named. And I think he chose his loyalties." That phrase, "chose his loyalties," exploded. It made headlines from the Wall Street Journal to NPR. It became a rallying cry, a quiet signal for those who weren't just outraged, but fed up. Because what Bondi uncovered wasn't just shady, it was systemic. A judge who delayed rulings, redirected hearings, moved timelines to benefit particular legal teams. One email said, "Keep this one in my courtroom." Too risky for another judge. Another, marked personal, hinted at adjusting hearings around upcoming political appointments. Nothing on its own proved guilt, but together, it painted a portrait of protection, not of justice. And still, Boasberg stayed silent. No interviews, no denials, just a bland statement from his clerk. Judge Boasberg has always served with integrity and will respond through the appropriate legal channels. But the public didn't want procedure. They wanted answers. Bondi's critics tried to paint her as reckless. Some accused her of revenge, of playing political games. But she wasn't alone anymore. Veterans, small business owners, even former court clerks who'd worked under Boasberg began coming forward, not with fireworks, but with patterns. "I remember a deportation case," said a translator from Loretto. "The file disappeared, then it was reassigned to his courtroom. A paralegal in Ohio claimed her team was told to delay filings. A friendly judge wanted jurisdiction, they were told, not bombshells." But together the image was clear. And Bondi, she wasn't done. She gave one last interview before disappearing from the spotlight. No flashy set, no makeup artist, just her, sitting across from a local reporter who asked the question everyone else was afraid to: "Are you worried about the political cost of this?" Her answer hit like a hammer. "Let the consequences come. I'd rather lose my seat than lose my spine." That line didn't just trend, it roared. It was stamped on coffee mugs, taped to office cubicles. It was mocked by her critics, adored by her supporters, but no one could deny what it meant. It was the sound of someone who wasn't bluffing. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the DOJ was preparing for a case unlike anything in recent memory. Judges don't face criminal charges often, and even fewer face them with the full weight of the federal government bearing down. Bondi had made her move, and now the system had no choice but to respond. When the indictment was unsealed, it was surgical. No shouting, no dramatic press event, just a stark announcement: obstruction of justice, misuse of judicial authority, willful concealment of evidence, and failure to recuse. Legal circles ignited. Law firms issued urgent internal memos. Judges held quiet emergency meetings. And inside federal buildings across the country, emails were suddenly being locked, flagged, or quietly deleted. The ripple had become a wave. But what made this different, what made it feel real, wasn't just the charges. It was the proof. Bondi's office released a short batch of internal messages, not classified but damaging. One text: "Keep this one in my courtroom, too risky for reassignment." Another: "We'll time discovery around the new appointments. He's got our back." Not smoking guns, but enough to make Americans sit up and say, "Wait, what's going on here?" Judge Boasberg didn't go to the press. He didn't hold a conference. He didn't even appear in court through the front doors. On a gray morning in Alexandria, marshals walked him through a side entrance, out of view of the crowd and cameras gathered outside. His suit was crisp, his expression blank. The man who once presided over the most sensitive national security matters now stood behind a defendant's table, stone-faced, while the charges were read aloud. He pled not guilty. Outside, the divide couldn't have been clearer. Protesters held up signs demanding transparency. Others defended him, saying the judiciary was under attack. TV anchors floundered for tone, legal analysts were split. But beneath it all, the same question hung in the air. Can we trust the people behind the bench anymore? The American judiciary had long been seen as something sacred. Judges didn't rant on social media. They didn't chase headlines. They wore robes, not campaign buttons. That distance had always given them a kind of quiet reverence. But now, that reverence was cracking. And Bondi? She didn't say a word after the indictment. No speech, no tour. Her office went dark, except for one message: "We will let the process speak." But she knew what she'd done. She hadn't just filed charges. She'd opened a door no one wanted opened. One morning, weeks after the case hit the news, her assistant handed her a plain padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter, handwritten in shaky cursive. It was from a retired federal clerk in Santa Fe. "I watched Judge Boasberg override a colleague in 2017, it read. It was an immigration hold, no press. The man was released. 2 months later, he killed a sheriff's deputy in Oklahoma. We all knew, no one said a word. She never shared that letter publicly. She didn't have to. Because by then, the stories had started coming on their own. Not always clear, not always clean, but consistent. Whispers of decisions made in quiet offices, rulings that favored the same firms, messages that disappeared too fast, phone calls that left no logs. A dozen small cracks in a structure that was supposed to be solid. And still Boasberg said nothing. His legal team issued the same statement again and again, that the case was an egregious political overreach, that Bondi was weaponizing her office, that he had done nothing wrong, but none of those words could explain the messages, the delays, the missing records, the sealed logs, the stalling. People started picking sides. Some legal scholars warned this was a dangerous precedent, that it could turn judges into political targets, that a single attorney general could now pull a thread and unravel the robe. But others said, no, this wasn't about power, it was about limits. Because power without accountability, that wasn't law, that was a lie. In D.C., the walls were shaking. Senators called for Bondi to be investigated, others praised her, legal organizations filed complaints, editorials roared from both sides, and yet through the noise, something else began to shift. The public started watching again. People who hadn't cared about courtrooms in years were now reading filings, watching hearings, following every update like it mattered, because suddenly it did. The trial date approached, slowly, cautiously. Motions were filed, challenges were raised, but then came the verdict. Late spring, no music, no camera flashes, just a gavel and a sentence. Boasberg was not found guilty on all counts. Several charges were dropped, key messages were erased too early, crucial timelines too muddied, but two stuck: willful concealment of evidence and misuse of judicial authority. The sentence: loss of his bench, permanent disbarment, recommendation for a full federal review of every case he presided over in the last decade. No jail time, but no return either. There was no speech from Bondi, no celebration. She stood in her office, looked toward the Jefferson Memorial, and whispered, that's one. She wasn't smiling. She looked tired, but her eyes were still clear, because she knew this wasn't about one man. It never was. For a moment, the country quieted, not because the fight was over, but because everyone had finally seen behind the curtain. Not a conspiracy, not a cabal, just a flawed system run by flawed people pretending to be untouchable. And that illusion, it was gone. Now, one anonymous clerk from Boston said it best in an interview. He wasn't a villain. He really believed he was doing the right thing. But that's not enough, not when you wear the robe. And Bondi? She made sure the country remembered that justice without accountability isn't justice at all. That real power isn't what you do when everyone's watching. It's what you choose when no one is. And even now, as Bondi stepped back into the shadows, the shockwaves hadn't stopped. A quiet internal DOJ program was launched, new reviews, new oversight mechanisms. It didn't make headlines, but it mattered. Because now someone was watching. And that's what scared them. Not the charges, not the scandal, but the fact that someone looked and didn't look away. They called it overreach, a vendetta, a reckless crusade, but she had a word for it too. Duty. And in the end, the quietest question still echoed the loudest. If he hadn't been caught, how many more would have stayed hidden? Because if one judge fell, how many more were still standing behind the curtain? And what if they weren't standing alone? This story leaves us with a deep lesson. Power without accountability is a house of cards waiting to fall. Judge Boasberg's downfall wasn't just about one man. It was a reminder that no one is above the truth, no matter how high they climb. In our own lives, it's a call to hold ourselves and others to a standard of integrity, whether at work, in relationships, or even online. When we let excuses shield bad behavior, we risk building systems, personal or societal, that crumble under scrutiny. Pam Bondi showed that courage to confront corruption can spark change, and we can too, by speaking up when it counts. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride. Your support keeps these stories alive. Drop a comment with your thoughts, hit that like button, and subscribe for more eye-opening tales.